Greetings, APUSH scholars, looking at the review sheet, Unit 7, the Civil War and Reconstruction from top to bottom. The phrase "cotton is king" refers to a speech from Senator James Hammond of South Carolina in 1858, and it's in reference to this idea that the cotton plantation economies of the South are really invulnerable. After the Panic of 1857, which hammered northern industry and banks, the South came out relatively unscathed. And going into the Civil War here, the South believed that cotton was something that would get them aid from Great Britain in particular, because the British textile industry depended upon cotton for the employment of several million Brits. And in fact, the South even embargoes cotton to try to force Britain's hand. And later this all backfires on the South when the North blockades southern ports. The South, which is dependent upon this monoculture of cotton, the South can't sell it, they certainly can't eat it, and they can't tax what they can't sell. So cotton is king is kind of an ironic confidence, what made the South relatively wealthy. At least the white planters becomes the point of greatest vulnerability economically for the South. The Battle of Antietam, it's significant. This battle has three real big consequences. One is that Lincoln feels he is dealing from a position of strength to abolish slavery in the rebellious regions of the South on January 1st, 1863. Secondly, the Emancipation Proclamation allows the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. And third, this victory is going to cause Great Britain to not just hesitate, but to totally fail to recognize the South as an independent nation and to give them the aid that the South wanted. And what the Emancipation did and did not do, you should be careful not to say that it frees all the slaves. It frees the slaves in areas of rebellion. It very specifically does not free slaves in the border states. Remember, these border states are 4 slave states which do not join the Confederacy. They stay loyal to the Union. And these would be Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. And referring again to the black soldiers that do join the Army after the Emancipation Proclamation, this is a significant number which make a major contribution eventually to the Northern victory. About 10% of the Army, about 200,000. This is an approximation, but you get the idea here. A tremendous number of black soldiers do join, enlist, and fight in the Union Army. Jefferson Davis's reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation. I think it's important to know the reaction of the South. Jefferson Davis on January 5th declares in retaliation for this, you should read his January 5th message. He talks about this inversion of the right social order here, and he orders all free blacks in the South, and we're talking about several 100,000, to be immediately enslaved. Further, he says that any free blacks in the North, in the course of the Southern Army fighting on Northern territory, will be captured and sold into slavery. On January 12th, we're talking here just 11 days after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Jefferson Davis orders that all white officers leading black soldiers, white Union officers leading African-American soldiers, be turned over to their respective states, the southern states where the fighting is taking place, to be tried for inciting slave insurrection. And this is basically a code for the execution of white officers, because that is the punishment for inciting slave insurrection. And this leads to the July 30, 1863 Lincoln retaliation order, in which he says that for every Union soldier, black or white, that is executed, that one Southern rebel POW will be taken and shot. Furthermore, any Union soldier which is sold into slavery upon capture will lead to a Confederate POW being put to hard labor in a prison camp. Now, we know that Lincoln's retaliation order was never published, was never sent. We do know that the South, when they captured black soldiers, either enslaved them or murdered them along with their white officers. So Jefferson Davis's reaction, which is one of the January 12th, is actually part of a speech to the Confederate Congress, shows the deep racism and the real reasons why the Civil War is being fought. And I would refer you to the past review looking at the Declaration of Causes of Secession by the Southern states. There's very little reference to anything economic or referring to taxation. It's entirely about slavery. The Confiscation Act of 1861 is kind of a precursor to the Emancipation Proclamation. It says that any slaves that are aiding Confederate armies when they're captured by the Union Army will be freed. Gettysburg and the New York City draft riots. You should know that the New York City draft riots, which follow approximately a week after the Northern victory at Gettysburg, New York City sort of explodes into rioting between basically poor whites, poor Irish against poor free blacks. And the blacks are victims of Irish immigrants who are poor. They're horribly poor. They're living in slum conditions, and they resent being drafted and sent off to fight for the freedom of poor blacks who are moving to New York City and, in their eyes, taking food out of the mouths of themselves and their families, competing for jobs and driving down wages. So these riots are kind of notorious. Some Union Army soldiers have to be sent up to New York to help suppress this riot. Government violations of civil rights during the Civil War. The AP tests have asked several times, more than once, about violations of civil rights during wartime, and you can refer to, of course, John Adams and the Alien Sedition Acts. You can refer later to Woodrow Wilson and the Espionage and Sedition Acts during that era. But during the Civil War, Lincoln suspends habeas corpus in areas where there is suspected secessionist strength, such as Maryland. Various journalists and editors and politicians are thrown into jail without trial, without charges, without access to lawyers and things like subpoenas and cross-examination and juries and things. That habeas corpus is basically suspending your right to a trial. And Lincoln, approximately 14,000 people are thrown in jail without habeas corpus. This does include, though, the arrest of deserters, the arrests of smugglers, the arrest of Southern guerrillas. Jefferson Davis, now this is also left out of every history book that I've ever seen. Jefferson Davis suspends habeas corpus in the South. So this is going on in the South as well as in the North. And the Southern suspension of habeas corpus under Davis allows for the arrest or expulsion of anyone who doesn't declare their loyalty to the Confederacy and the confiscation of any non-Confederate citizens' property. So Northern property is going to be confiscated across the South, sort of kind of like the confiscation of Tory property by the American revolutionaries. Too bad there's not the synthesis portion anymore on the AP test. Anyhow, Copperheads are the Southern sympathizers, the Democrats who are hostile to Lincoln for various reasons. Some of those reasons are the Civil War is a bloodbath. It's being fought from their perspective incompetently. There's the violation of civil liberties. There's the expansion of government by those who want government not to be expanded. Things like use of national currency and transcontinental railroad and high tariffs. There is criticism of the draft, and certainly there's the racism of many, if not most, Northern Democrats. You should know the Supreme Court case Ex parte Milligan. Milligan was an Indiana Copperhead, an opponent of the Civil War in Lincoln, who planned to steal military arms and to liberate a Confederate POW camp. He's arrested in 1864. He's convicted by a military court in 1865, and he appeals his case to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1866 says that Lincoln, yes, can suspend habeas corpus in time of war, but that the U.S. government cannot try citizens in military courts where civilian courts are still loyal and in operation. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, in contrast to the congressional plan or the Wade Davis plan, Lincoln's plan is quite simple. He wants leniency. He wants a quick restoration of the Union, and he has a 10% loyalty oath. 10% of Southerners in an area, in a state that's liberated, if they swear loyalty, the state's back in upon ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. The congressional plan, which is harsher, and this is eventually going to be the one that's enacted after Lincoln is assassinated, they want some harshness. They want a little bit of revenge. They want an ironclad majority oath of a majority, not 10%. They do want the 13th Amendment ratified, but they also have some other things. They want no ex-Confederate soldiers or officials in government or voting. They want the repudiation of all Confederate debts, so they want no loans made to the Confederate Army to be paid back. And they want not just a repeal, but they want a repudiation of the acts of succession. You know, some of these terms here, scalawags are Southerners who are loyal to the Union before and after the war here, largely seen by their neighbors as traitors. Carpetbaggers are Northerners who came to the South to take positions of power and to perhaps do investments, buying up farms and businesses. The Freedmen's Bureau is a protection of the freedmen, passed by Congress over Johnson's veto, and this set up thousands of schools in the South, set up various courts to deal with conflict between former slaves and their masters or their employers. And the Freedmen's Bureau dished out food rations and gave limited aid to the sick. But this was, I'm going to think of it as sort of a welfare agency to help the freedmen who had needs that needed to be addressed. The dominant party in the South after Reconstruction, of course, is the Democratic Party. It's the Republican Lincoln who, in the Republican Congress, that defeat the South after 4 years of war. Now, keep in mind, there is in many areas a domination by the Republicans under the Reconstruction governments, as long as the ex-Confederates are kept out of power, and as long as the black Republican former slaves are allowed to vote. But once Reconstruction ends by 1877, you basically have a one-party system across the South all the way up until the 1960s, early 1970s under Nixon. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, you should know these amendments. 13th abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment says that all citizens born, all those who are born or naturalized as citizens of the United States are, all those who are born in the United States have the full rights of citizens in the United States government or in the states they reside. And this also applies to naturalized citizens. 15th Amendment specifically gives all citizens the right to vote. The political reform and the reality for the freedmen. Well, on paper, it looks like you have an end to slavery, you have full citizenship and voting rights, but you should be very aware of the restrictions for the next 100 years, making the freedmen, making black Americans second-class citizens in their own country. One is limits on the right to vote. You have the right to vote. But remember, states can put limits on voting, and you have age limits, which today we still have. You have residency requirements, which we still have. But back then, specifically to keep the freedmen from voting, you had poll taxes, you had literacy tests, you had the famous grandfather clause, and you had the Ku Klux Klan, which is not a legal limit, but it's certainly an extra-legal terrorist organization which threatened to attack, threatened to kill, threatened the families of the freedmen to keep them from voting. You have what are called the Black Codes. And the Black Codes are laws that are set up to keep the freedmen basically on the farms, on the plantations, working. And the most famous thing that really happens here is these vagrancy laws. If you don't have a job, if you're found wandering, you can be arrested and you can be tried, and your conviction will be working off your sentence. And by the 1880s in Alabama, over 10% of the workers in the state are convict labor chain gangs, working on roads, working on farms, working in the woods, chopping trees and making lumber and whatever. You have also Jim Crow, which, in distinction from the Black Codes, Jim Crow is basically the enforcement of segregation law, segregation between the white and the black community. So you have blacks being segregated in theaters and being in waiting rooms at train stations and in bathrooms and in beaches and public parks and in hotels and restaurants and you name it. You also have sharecropping, which is where there's a shortage of labor by the masters who no longer have slaves, and of course there is the need for jobs for the former slaves who don't have property, and you have this working for a share of the future crop. These contracts would be signed where you're not making money, but you're getting a share of the crop. Now keep in mind here, the masters or the employers are keeping the books here, and they are making loans for seed and for the mule and for the plow and for food that you're eating while you're waiting for the crop to come in, and there's interest accruing. And guess who is keeping the books and who is deciding on any disputes between the employer and employee. Yeah, right. You have Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 is a Supreme Court which is going to rule that separate but equal, that segregation is constitutional as long as there are equal facilities. And the argument of Southern racists is going to be, hey, there's a black school and a white school. They're both equal. They're both doing the job of educating the citizens here. But it's very clear here that black facilities were in no way remotely equal to anything that whites had, whether it be a railway car or whether it be a drinking fountain, a bathroom, a bench, or a school. Why Johnson was impeached. Now, be clear here. Impeachment is not the same as conviction. Impeachment means to be charged. The House impeaches and the Senate holds the trial and need 2/3 to toss a president out. Johnson is impeached officially for violating the Tenure of Office Act, which says that a president cannot fire a member of his cabinet without Congress's okay. And Johnson is in opposition to Lincoln's former Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and he fires him. And for this reason, he's put on trial, and he does in the Senate. And by one vote, he is not convicted. He is impeached, but he's not convicted. The real reason for this whole deal here is that Johnson he's the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Remember, Lincoln in 1864 is not confident he's going to win re-election. So he gets rid of Hannibal Hamlin, who was his vice president in his first term, and he picks the only Southern senator who did not leave office and join the South, and that was Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, who is a Democrat, who is a Southerner, who is a states' righter short of secession, and who is a pretty staunch extreme racist. And while he is president, Johnson is going to veto the Freedmen's Bureau, which is overridden. He's going to veto the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which becomes the basis of the 14th Amendment, and this is going to be overridden. He's going to go on a train tour around the South, urging Southern states not to ratify the 14th Amendment, which is part of the condition of coming back into the Union later. And the control of the Army is going to be taken out of his hands. So Johnson is a guy who basically he's alienated the Northern Republicans, in particular the radicals, and they want him out. This guy is, for all the reasons stated, is not a Republican. The significance of the presidential election of 1876, Sam Tilden, the Democrat, wins by 250,000 popular votes, but as you all know, there is no President Sam Tilden. He didn't win the required majority of electoral votes. In fact, there were 4 states where the electoral votes were hanging, in particular 3 southern states, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon. And there's a dispute here where Southerners are basically claiming that Northerners are stuffing the ballot boxes and keeping them from voting, and Northerners are saying Southerners are stuffing the ballot boxes and keeping blacks from voting. So a commission is set up which has members from the House and from the Senate and from the Supreme Court. It rules 8-7 to give the disputed electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, who does become president. Now, to keep the South from rebelling again here over a stolen election, the compromise of rebelling politically, of course, the Civil War is over. The compromise of 1877 sees this whole thing diffuse. The South accepts Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, as the winner, even though the Northern Democrat, Sam Tilden, had more popular votes. On these terms here, one, the South gets a cabinet position, which is the Postmaster General position, a source of prime patronage. Secondly, money is promised for internal development in the South, such as railroads. And the big kicker here is third, the North agrees to pull their troops out of the South. Remember, the South is put under military rule, under the Military Reconstruction Act, which was passed in 1867, by the way, vetoed by Johnson and overridden by the Congress. And why does the North agree to pull its troops out? Well, part of the deal here to win this election, partly because after 12 years of Reconstruction, the North is kind of fed up with the South. There's a certain amount of boredom, perhaps. The West is beckoning. You have the North is booming, and Northern businessmen are sympathetic to the idea of controlling your laborers. And I would peg it, though, really, there's just a lack of interest. There's a lot of racism in the North. Keep the black freedmen in the South. We certainly don't want them coming north from the point of view of many Northerners. And the Northern Army leaves. And in some Southern history books, these people that come into office, the Democrats who dial back the clock here and impose the black codes and Jim Crow, they're called the Redeemers. So you have about 100 years of second-class citizenship until we get to the 1960s Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 65. Anyhow, there is your review specifically for this review sheet for this Unit 7. Okay, gang, study hard, study well, study smart. Good luck.